So for my first video here, I figured I would work with something that ties in with my background and username. So, username came about because I did a doctorate in literature and focused on werewolves. So I thought today I would talk about, or now I'd talk about, the idea of what's traditional versus what's traditional about shifters and werewolves. So when most of us, when most of us think about werewolf, what tends to come to mind is that image, the sort of wild, monstrous figure runs around Hollywood, man beast, eats people, that sort of thing. And many people consider this to be traditional. However, there are going to be two types that I divide traditions into two types. We got types or categories. We got types of wolf and traits. So before getting to that though, I want to first note that werewolves are probably the most common type of shapeshifters in folklore, legend, stories, etc. Because they have spread around the world. The wolves, like people, are very adaptable, have appeared on every continent, and we get stories of shapeshifters, people turning into wolves on pretty much every continent or very many cultures, at least those that are inhabited. Just Europe alone, we've got scores, possibly even hundreds of different traditions going into play. So when we talk about traditional, we want to be somewhat careful of generalizations, because there are lots and lots and lots of cultural takes on the idea of the werewolf figure. So what's traditional in one place, say Italy, is going to be different from what's traditional in Germany, is going to be different from what's traditional in the Americas, North America particularly, is going to be different from what's traditional in, say, Southeast Asian stories or whatever it happens to be. So when looking at types, there are two broad types of werewolf figures. Now it's kind of difficult, I'd say impossible to tell which, if either, came first, because they seem to be largely together. And we go back, the figure goes back at least 30,000 years. We have an image of shapeshifter in cave paintings referred to as the sorcerer in France. It could be protective, which is how people tend to interpret it. Could also be threatening, depending on how we look at it. So the first one is the first major type, and there may be other things that don't quite fit in perfectly. The first major type is the monstrous werewolf. And that's one everybody tends to think of. That's the sort of villain, tends to be the villain of things. We see that in Petronius's Satyricon, with the wolf who is a feared and seen as violent and ready to eat people. We see that one in Ovid's Metamorphoses with the story of Lycaon, who is turned into a wolf by Zeus for various reasons. We have that come up in Renaissance werewolf trials, such as that of Peter Stubb, or in Germany, or the trials and discussions brought up by Jean Grenier in France, or ones referenced by King James I of England in the early 1600s. And these are the ones that tend to run around and they eat people or attack people or do various other sorts of things. They often get tied up, particularly in the Renaissance, they get tied up with witchcraft trials, and they tend to be seen as the figures that have all of the negative traits of humanity that we don't wish to associate ourselves with, and we try to pass off to the beast or the wolf side, even if it doesn't really make sense from observed wolf behavior and whatnot. The other form is what we generally refer to as a sympathetic werewolf. These are going to be figures who tend to be heroic figures, who tend to be either the protagonist, or they aid the protagonist or assist the protagonist in various ways. And these ones, a good classic example is in the Friuli region of Italy, and I'm probably mispronouncing that, and I'm probably mispronouncing the name as well, are the Benedanti, who would change into wolf or semi-wolf forms once a year, 4 times a year, twice a year, depending on the tradition, and basically fight the forces of hell, Satan, etc., on behalf of the populace to ensure a good harvest and these sorts of things. These ones go back at least to as far back as Lycan, as far back as Petronius, even further. One of the earliest examples is probably the figure Demarchus, who was from a region of Greece, and it was said that people of that region would bathe or go into and come out of a particular body of water once a year, and for the remainder of that year they would be able to take the form of a wolf. Demarchus stands out and becomes part of the written record, because he was also an Olympic champion. I don't recall if it was in boxing or wrestling, but one of the two that he won Olympics in. Other good examples come out of the 12th century with, I'm probably going to totally mispronounce this name, this character Bsky from Marie of France in one of her lays, which are essentially little short stories or extended poems. Or Alphonse, who is part of the Romance of William of Pellerne, also came out of French, but translated into English in the 14th century, which I might read bits of later on, just for fun, out loud. Also, we see them entering the Arthurian legends with a kind of obscure story called Arthur and Gorlagon, which is very similar to William in some respects and to Marie's story, in that some of the basic ideas are the same and some of the basic story is the same in terms of the transformation, somebody being stuck in wolf shape, these sorts of things for a time, and the wolf being a positive figure rather than a monstrous or negative figure. In between, we do have a few other figures that don't quite fit. We should kind of expect this, given that the whole point of the werewolf is that it causes problems for categorization and such, and classification. So in between, we have things like the Norse Ulfhethnar, which is U-L-F-H-E Thorn, N-A-R, which basically Thorn's like a backwards 6 with a line through the top stem. Sometimes it's mistaken for a D. Basically, this literally translates as wolf cloaks, and from the Norse, and they were a type of one of the two big types of warriors who were considered to be shape-shifting or to channel a animal species. The other, of course, being the more common and more familiar berserker or bear shirt. So the Ulfhethnars were ones who epitomized the ideal of the sort of pack, the working together, the raiding party, these sorts of things. Both seen as beneficial to raiding, but also as potential threats because they could lose control and those sorts of things. Both traditions continue on. We have monstrous werewolves appearing, particularly popular in the 18th, 19th centuries. The early movies, particularly the Hammer films, the classic Wolfman, American Werewolf in London, American Werewolf in Paris, those sorts of movies. Most recently in Marvel's Werewolf by Night short on Disney, Disney Plus. We also see appearing in sort of the PNR, paranormal romance and urban fantasy setups from time to time. The sympathetic we also see crossing around, and it kind of disappeared from most of the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, came back in the mid to late 20th in a lot of figures. Most famously, I would say is probably going to be the Remus Lupin character from the Harry Potter series, who is mirrored by the monstrous figure in Greyback, working together. And those are actually weirdly introduced the same way the figures are introduced in Marie. Marie of France leads off with her talking about the werewolf, or the monstrous wolf, and then she introduces the sympathetic werewolf, and then continues from there. In much the same way, Rowling, who studied French literature, introduces the idea of Fenris Greyback, the monstrous werewolf, not in person, but in discussion, and the kind of scare and the kind of fear of the werewolf. And then she introduces us to Remus, the sympathetic werewolf, and then we come back to bringing both of them together. The other aspect that comes in is the idea of what we consider to be, well, traditional traits. And most of the traditional things that people consider to be traditional traits are only a few hundred years old. So we've had werewolf figures and shape-shifting figures for probably 30,000 or more years. We've had popular werewolves for probably the last 6,000 to 10,000 years. But a lot of the traits that people consider to be traditional are only within the last 100 to 200 years, borderline 300. For example, the Wolfman, the human-wolf hybrid, only seems to be in the Benedante form, and only occasionally in that, until about the 18th or 19th century. And then it was popularized by the 1930s film, The Wolfman and all of those sorts of follow-ups, Underworld and all those things coming on later on. But during the classical period, the medieval period, the Renaissance periods in Europe at least, people who were werewolves typically turned from people to wolves and didn't have a sort of in-between form. The same seems to hold true for most cultures as well. I'm not too aware of examples that don't necessarily fit that, but the European ones are what I'm more familiar with as a medievalist and early modernist. The idea of silver and the association of silver and werewolves, that doesn't really appear until the 18th, 19th century. That also appears alongside the concept of regeneration. Regeneration doesn't appear in the early stories at all. It doesn't appear in the medieval stories, doesn't appear in the Renaissance stories, it doesn't appear in the classical stories, the Greek and Romans. It doesn't seem to appear until about the 1700s, 1800s. That said, sharing injuries in both forms. The werewolf can be recognized by the human who doesn't have a little finger and the wolf who's missing part of its paw. That goes back a bit further. Hard to tell exactly when, but it does date back a bit further. However, the idea of the werewolf regrowing or fixing its own injuries is pretty recent in that regard. And that's also when silver comes into play, because you don't necessarily need something that it is vulnerable to until you have the healing element and the regeneration element coming into play. Then we get the silver stories coming into play as something to negate the regeneration capability. Likewise, bite transmission, somebody being bitten and turning into a werewolf, doesn't really exist until about the 19th century, when germ theory really started taking off and becoming a thing. Before that point, it's often the form of a curse, whether Zeus curses Lycaon to be a wolf because Lycaon did bad stuff, or Gorlagon and Alphonse are turned into wolves because their spouse or stepmother wants them out of the way, or bsky is stuck in a wolf form because his clothing is taken away and stolen. But in some cases, it seems to be more or less a natural capability. In the case of bsky, for example, he seems to just be able to there's no discussion of how he changes or how he got this power. He's always seemed to have had this. Demarcus goes into a pool, comes out of the pool, and hey, he can change forms. This sort of thing. Bite to become needs germ theory in order to exist. And then once we have that, we get the idea of lycanthropy, shape-shifting as a form of disease, as something that can be transmitted from one individual to another, versus being part of a spell or part of a natural capability or part of a ritual that somebody does. Other big one that comes up later on that we consider traditional but isn't necessarily is the idea of werewolves changing when at moon phases. This also may have some association with silver. There are connections, metaphorical, folkloric, etc. connections between moon and silver, but we don't really see moon change coming in until about the 19th century, maybe a little bit in the 18th century. Doesn't really come about until then. Before that era, we have the only time we have a strong connection between a werewolf having and the moon is this guy by the name of Gervase of Tilbury in the 12th to early 13th centuries, who floated that idea and that concept. And most people of his era looked at it and kind of dismissed that idea. Various speakers, various people who talked about werewolf theories at that point in time, even in through the 16th and 17th centuries, like Jean Grenier or James I or Reginald Scott, dismissed this idea and said, yeah, Gervais doesn't know what he's talking about. So it was kind of a minority idea or concept at that point in time until about the 1800s. Then it started taking off. And obviously it's entered into modern folklore, modern stories and such since then. So that's sort of where these sort of traditional ideas or traits came from. And they're not really all that old. If we go back into the pre-18th century, typically speaking, what you get for a werewolf is a person who can turn into a wolf. They might be stuck in that form for a time. They generally cannot talk. They might be monstrous. They might be sympathetic. They might retain human mind. In fact, most do, particularly the medieval ones. They may change at will. They might change for a variety of reasons. They may go completely wild and tear people apart and all that sort of stuff. But what we do not see is human-wolf hybrids. We don't see silver coming in. We don't see bite transmission coming in. We don't see regeneration. We don't see forced moon changes coming in. We don't see associations with wolfsbane or any of that sort of thing until significantly later. If you'd like a deeper look into some of these things and some of these ideas, I do highly recommend this book, A Lycanthropy Reader, Werewolves in Western Culture, from Charlotte Otten, that was published in 1980 something from Dorset Press, 1986, and then 1989 for Dorset Press. It's a very good overview of a lot of different primary sources and some secondaries, ranging from psychiatric cases to 17th century cases like Robert Burton and Reginald Scott and Robert Bayfield, to 12th century things like Gerald of Wales talking about Ireland, or Jean Grenier in the 1600s, or Peter Stubbs' case, or Henri Bouget in the late 16th century, or Kramer and Springer's Malleus Maleficarum from the 15th century, or James I's Demonology in 1597, or various short stories or discussions of the Norse sagas, classical myths, all the way up through some 19th century stories from people like Clemens Hausman and who's the one on here? Eric Steinbach. There's also some Eugene Field from the early 20th century. She has another book that also includes some from Saki and some other folks as well. Another good one, if you're looking for just kind of an overview of the kind of history of, is this The Beast Within from Adam Douglas. It's a nice cheap copy, or a nice cheap book from Avon Books. I think it came from 1994. It's a good overview from a generalist perspective. As if you enjoyed this, if you found something useful out of it, please go ahead and hit the likes, subscribe. I'll probably be doing more videos. If you'd like any other support, I've got a Ko-Fi link in the description, as well as a link to my Instagram and to my books. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed.